Daniel Brooks had always been known in the town of Austin's outskirts as the man who could fix anything with an engine. Cars, trucks, even an old tractor or two had been revived under his skilled hands, but what the townspeople didn't know was that behind the grease-stained shirt and tired smile was a man quietly sinking under the weight of unpaid bills. His garage, once a proud family business handed down from his father, now sat in disrepair. Tools were scattered carelessly, parts lay abandoned, and the roof leaked whenever the rain poured. Still, Daniel kept the doors open, clinging to hope that tomorrow would somehow be better. That particular evening, rain lashed against the small town, thunder rumbling in the distance. Daniel sat alone in his dimly lit shop, a single bulb swaying gently above his head as he tightened bolts on an old pickup. His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since morning, but there was no time for food. He needed money, and every hour spent working was another step toward keeping the garage alive. Just as he wiped his hands on a rag, he heard the slow creak of his garage door opening. He expected another customer with a broken-down vehicle, but what he saw instead left him frozen. A young woman was being pushed inside by her friend. The wheelchair beneath her was worn, one wheel squeaking loudly, its seat cracked and fraying at the edges. The woman looked exhausted, but carried an air of quiet strength. Her long brown hair, dampened by the rain, clung to her face. "Sir, can you fix this?" she asked, her voice trembling but hopeful. Daniel knelt instinctively to inspect the chair. The metal frame was bent, the wheels uneven, and the footrests barely holding together. He had fixed countless machines in his life, but never something so fragile, so personal. And yet, as he looked into her eyes, he saw something that made him pause. Determination. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, just 27 years old, yet her eyes held the weight of someone who had endured far more than her years should allow. She explained quietly that a car accident had stolen her ability to walk 2 years ago. Doctors had told her bluntly that she would never stand on her own again. The words had shattered her once bright spirit, but she refused to surrender completely. The chair she relied on was now barely usable, and without it, her world would shrink even smaller. Daniel listened silently, his heart tightening. Here was a young woman facing challenges far greater than late bills or an old garage. "I can try," Daniel finally said, his voice steady but thoughtful. He stood up, rubbing his tired eyes before continuing. "But maybe I can build you something better." Sarah blinked, almost unsure she had heard him correctly. Most mechanics would have patched the chair up with a few bolts and sent her on her way. Yet Daniel was speaking as if he saw beyond the broken metal he was, looking at her as a human being who deserved more than a temporary fix. The first time in months, Sarah's lips curved into a fragile smile. The flicker of hope in her eyes was unmistakable. Her friend, still standing behind her, looked skeptical. "Sir, she's been to specialists, people with degrees and labs, and they couldn't help her. What makes you think you can?" Daniel didn't flinch at the doubt. He simply lowered himself again, inspecting every joint and every broken piece of the chair with the same focus he used when rebuilding an engine. "Machines are machines," he said softly. "They just need someone willing to listen, and right now this one is crying for help." The friend fell silent, perhaps recognizing that Daniel's quiet confidence came from a place of sincerity, not arrogance. As Sarah watched him, something shifted inside her. For 2 long years she had been pitied, ignored, or told her limits. No one had looked at her with the conviction that she could still fight, still dream. Daniel's words were not grand promises, but they were real, and that truth was enough to awaken something she thought she had lost: belief. "Then I trust you," she whispered. Her words startled even herself, but she meant them. She had nothing left to lose. Daniel met her gaze and gave the smallest nod, a silent pact forming between them. The rain outside grew heavier, hammering against the tin roof of the garage. Yet inside, the atmosphere felt strangely calm. Daniel rolled the chair closer to his workbench, his fingers already tracing the broken joints, his mind racing with ideas. Sarah sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, watching this stranger pour attention into the very object that defined her daily existence. She noticed how his brow furrowed, how his rough hands moved with care, as though handling something sacred. For the first time in years, she felt like someone saw her not as a burden, but as a person worth fighting for. The night stretched on, the storm outside refusing to quiet, but within the garage, something new had begun to take root. Daniel, the struggling mechanic who could barely keep his own life together, had unknowingly stepped into a moment that would change everything for Sarah, for himself, and perhaps even for the town that had long overlooked both of them. It wasn't just about a wheelchair anymore. It was about hope on wheels, and the belief that even the most broken things could be rebuilt stronger than before. Days blurred together for Daniel Brooks, each one marked not by sunlight, but by the glow of his workbench lamp. His garage no longer smelled of gasoline and oil, but of burnt wires, solder, and metal shavings. He sold whatever spare car parts he could, pieces of engines he had once sworn to save, just to buy the materials he needed. Nights without dinner became normal, his stomach a hollow drum, yet he ignored its complaints. Every cent, every ounce of energy went into designing a machine that wasn't about horsepower or speed. It was about giving someone back their life. Sarah noticed his sacrifices long before he admitted them. Whenever she rolled into the garage in her old chair, she saw the dark circles under his eyes, the empty take-out boxes shoved aside, and the worn clothes he refused to replace. Still, Daniel greeted her with the same steady voice, always brushing away his exhaustion with a quick smile. Sometimes she brought him coffee, other times a homemade sandwich, though she knew he rarely ate more than a few bites before returning to his work. She wanted to protest, to tell him not to give so much of himself, but every time she saw the passion in his eyes, the words died on her tongue. The chair Daniel was building was unlike anything Sarah had seen before. Lightweight aluminum mixed with carbon fiber, wheels balanced with precision bearings, and adjustable supports, designed specifically for her posture and needs. It wasn't just functional, it was beautiful, sleek in a way that made it feel more like a gift than a tool. Sarah often found herself staring at it, her fingers tracing the smooth lines of the frame. Each time she asked him why he was doing this, why he was giving so much of himself, he simply shrugged and said, "Because someone needs to." His voice carried no pity, no hidden agenda, just an unshakable belief that she deserved more than the life she had been given. One stormy night, long after the town had gone to sleep, Sarah arrived unannounced at the garage. She found Daniel hunched over his workbench, sweat dripping from his brow, sparks flying as he welded a final joint into place. He looked up, surprised but not upset, as she rolled closer. "You should be resting," he said softly. "And you should be eating," she countered, with a teasing smile, setting a thermos of hot soup on the bench. For a moment they both laughed, the heaviness of their struggles lifting like fog. In that laughter, Sarah felt a warmth she hadn't known in years, the feeling of being seen, not as broken, but as whole. The prototype chair stood gleaming under the dim light, its metallic frame reflecting every flicker of the welding torch. Sarah's eyes widened in awe. It's incredible," she whispered. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag, his chest rising with both exhaustion and pride. "It's not just a chair," he said, slowly, almost as if confessing a secret. "Sarah, I'm not building this so you can sit. I believe you can walk again. And if this design works, it might change everything." His words hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. No doctor had ever said such a thing to her. No one had dared to offer her hope beyond the chair. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. For 2 years, she had trained herself not to dream of walking, not to imagine what it would feel like to stand again. Every specialist, every therapist had told her the same thing: you'll never recover. Yet here was a mechanic, a man who barely kept his own life together, telling her he saw a future they all denied. Tears stung her eyes, but not from sadness, from the overwhelming shock of being believed in. Her voice trembled. "Daniel, do you really think—" He cut her off gently, nodding. "I don't just think, I know. You're stronger than you realize." That night, with trembling hands, Sarah agreed to try. Daniel steadied the new wheelchair and adjusted the supports with a precision that came not from textbooks, but from heart. He guided her into the seat, making sure every strap and cushion held her securely. Sarah gripped the armrests, her knuckles white, her breath shaky. The garage was silent except for the sound of rain tapping against the windows, as if the whole world were holding its breath. Daniel crouched beside her, his hand hovering near hers. "Whenever you're ready," he whispered. "You don't have to rush." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, letting the silence wrap around her. She thought of the car accident that had taken everything, the countless nights she cried herself to sleep, the cold stares of strangers who saw only her chair. And now she thought of Daniel, of his faith, of his sacrifices. Slowly, carefully, she pressed down on the armrests, her muscles straining against years of weakness. Pain shot through her legs, sharp and electric, but she pushed anyway. The wheels locked, the frame held steady, and inch by inch her body began to rise. Her voice cracked into the quiet air. "I'm standing, I'm actually standing." Tears spilled down her cheeks, falling freely as she looked at Daniel. His eyes shone with pride, his lips parted in disbelief, and before he knew it, his own tears joined hers. He reached out, not to hold her up, but to steady the moment, as if afraid it might vanish. For a long time, neither spoke. The sound of rain and their quiet sobs were the only witnesses. Finally, Sarah laughed through her tears, the sound pure and childlike. "I never thought I'd feel this tall again," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. Daniel helped her ease back into the chair, careful not to let exhaustion undo her fragile progress. But the moment lingered in both of their hearts, larger than the walls of the garage could contain. Sarah had taken her first step, if only a symbolic one, toward a life she had thought was gone forever, and Daniel, the mechanic who once questioned his worth, now knew without doubt that his hands were capable of more than fixing cars. They were capable of rebuilding lives. That night, as the storm raged outside, 2 broken souls found themselves bound together by something greater than fate: hope, fragile but unshakable. For the first time in years, Sarah fell asleep that night with her heart light and her dreams alive. And for the first time in months, Daniel closed his eyes, knowing that maybe, just maybe, tomorrow would bring more than survival. It would bring a miracle. The weeks after Sarah's first steps seemed endless for Daniel. He went back to his old rhythm, fixing engines that coughed and sputtered, changing tires for customers who barely noticed the grease on his hands. Yet, in quiet moments, he found himself staring at the corner of his garage where Sarah had stood that night, her laughter, her tears, and the sight of her trembling legs refusing to give up haunted him like a beautiful dream. She had stopped visiting for several days, and though he told himself she was probably resting, a gnawing fear whispered maybe she was gone. Each evening he'd sit outside on the rusted metal stool by the garage door, watching the Texas sunset bleed across the sky. The sound of cicadas filled the warm air, and Daniel wondered if Sarah had given up on him, or worse, if her progress had faltered. He never expected thanks, he never wanted recognition, but her absence weighed heavy, leaving his heart hollow. Some nights he barely slept, imagining her struggling alone, imagining that maybe the world had let her down again. Still, each morning he rose with the same determination to work, because routine was all he had left. Then one bright afternoon, just as Daniel was tightening the bolts of an old Chevy, the air above the small town began to roar. At first, he thought it was thunder, though the sky was clear and blue. People spilled out of diners, shops, and homes, shading their eyes as a black helicopter circled low. The ground vibrated as it hovered directly above Daniel's garage. Dust swirled through the air, rattling windows and setting off car alarms. Children pointed, adults whispered, and the entire town gathered, their curiosity colliding with awe. Daniel stepped out, wiping grease from his hands, squinting against the sun as his heart pounded wildly. The sleek helicopter touched down in a gust of wind, blades chopping the air with deafening force. Daniel shielded his eyes, his mind racing. He didn't know what to expect. And then, as the door slid open, time seemed to stop. Sarah stepped out, her hair catching the sunlight, her steps steady and strong. No chair, no crutches. Just Sarah, walking across the pavement with confidence in every stride. The crowd gasped as one, voices rising in disbelief. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, his tools slipping from his hand and clattering to the ground. His knees nearly buckled. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. Tears welled in his eyes as Sarah closed the distance between them. Every step she took seemed like a miracle, every smile like a sunrise. She reached him and threw her arms around his shoulders, holding him tightly as the crowd erupted in applause. Daniel's arms trembled as he hugged her back, overcome with shock and emotion. "Dude, Sarah," he whispered, his voice breaking. She pulled back just enough to look into his tear-streaked face. Her voice shook but carried like a bell. "You didn't just fix a chair, Daniel. You fixed my life. I can walk again, thanks to you." The townspeople stood frozen in stunned silence before cheers rang out, echoing through the streets. Neighbors who had once seen Daniel as just another struggling mechanic now looked at him as if he were something more, something extraordinary. Cameras clicked, phones recorded, and children clapped with wide-eyed wonder. Daniel felt overwhelmed, his world spinning, yet Sarah's eyes anchored him, reminding him that this moment was real. Behind her, stepping out of the helicopter, came several sharply dressed men and women business partners, investors, people who looked far removed from small-town life. Their polished shoes and briefcases shimmered under the Texas sun. Sarah turned to them before facing Daniel once more, her smile wide, but her tears unstoppable. "Daniel," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I'm starting a foundation to help people with disabilities, to build technology and hope for those who've been told they can't. And I don't want to do it without you. I want you to lead it with me." Gasps swept through the crowd again, but Daniel stood motionless, unable to speak. His entire life had been one of survival, of barely scraping by, and now before him stood not just a woman healed, but a future he never dared imagine. He shook his head slowly, struggling to find words. "Sarah, I'm just a mechanic," he whispered, voice breaking. "I fix cars, I patch things together. I don't know anything about running a foundation." Sarah's hand reached for his, firm and steady. "You know about hope. You know what it means to give everything for someone else. That's more than enough. The world doesn't need another businessman in a suit. It needs you." Daniel's chest ached as her words sank in. He glanced around at the faces of his neighbors, the very people who had watched him struggle for years. For once, their eyes weren't filled with pity, they were filled with respect. Daniel swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he wiped the grease from his palms onto his worn jeans. He thought of the nights he had gone hungry, the days he had nearly lost the garage, and the moments he had doubted his worth. All of it had led here, to this very second, when a woman who once believed she'd never walk again now stood tall because he refused to quit. Slowly, he nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. If you believe in me, then I'll do it." Sarah's smile widened, tears streaming down her face as she pulled him into another hug. The crowd erupted, their cheers thunderous, echoing across the town like a celebration of something greater than both of them. From that day on, Daniel's life was never the same. The small-town mechanic who once doubted his own future became the face of a movement. The foundation grew, fueled by Sarah's vision and Daniel's heart. Together they traveled to hospitals, schools, and communities, unveiling wheelchairs and mobility designs unlike anything seen before. But more than technology, they delivered hope, the kind that made children smile, parents cry, and entire families believe again. Daniel never forgot the garage where it all began, never forgot the nights of hunger and doubt, but he carried them as proof that even the smallest acts of kindness could echo louder than the roar of any engine. And sometimes, late at night, when the applause faded and the work quieted, Daniel would sit alone and remember that rainy evening when a broken wheelchair rolled into his garage. He would remember Sarah's trembling voice asking, "Can you fix this?" and the way her eyes had lit up. When he said, "I can try," what began as a simple promise had grown into a miracle neither of them could have predicted. Daniel finally understood he hadn't just fixed a chair, he had fixed a future, and in doing so he had found his own.